Devin Graves coming to you once again from Studio D, and today I would like to demystify microphones. In the first section of the video, I'm going to talk more in generalities, and this is going to give you just some basic overview idea on how to think of different microphone types and which you should reach for on a given application. So basically there are four kinds of microphones, generally speaking. Large diaphragm condensers, small diaphragm condensers, dynamic mics, and ribbon mics. And within these types, there are different topologies, and we're going to get into all of that. But first, when you think of a large diaphragm mic, for instance, this is your typical go-to lead vocal mic, but they also work excellent for just about anything. Overheads, if you have a stereo pair, instruments, excellent acoustic guitar mics. But when you think of a large diaphragm condenser, think in terms of hi-fi. Think in terms of detail. They're going to really pull out all the fine nuances of an instrument or a voice. They're going to have an extended low, and they're probably going to have a kind of boost in the upper mids or the high mids. This is going to give it more of a hi-fi sound. So think hi-fi. Whatever goes into this mic is going to come out a little bit bigger. On the other hand, small diaphragm condensers will also give you great detail, if not even greater detail, but they're going to give you accuracy. They're not going to be so hi-fi necessarily. They're going to give you a more accurate representation of the instrument. So if you have a guitar player that really prized the sound of his acoustic guitar, maybe he doesn't want a lot of high frequency sheen added to the instrument. Maybe he wants it to sound more natural the way it sounds to his ear. Or anybody that plays a stringed instrument, a violin, harp, anything like that, they might really be purists and want to hear the instrument for how they're used to hearing it sound, and a small diaphragm condenser is the perfect choice for that. Two of them gives you stereo recording. A dynamic mic is fairly inexpensive by comparison. They have a contemporary curve that makes them really good for vocals and electric guitar amps because they cut off a lot of the lows. They don't have that extended low of either condenser mic. And they usually have a significant boost in the upper mid-range around 5 kilohertz or so that brings out the intelligibility of a voice. Also, they can withstand tremendous sound pressure levels compared to condensers. So if you have a very loud source, you can think of a dynamic mic, say a guitar amplifier, a snare drum, any drum for that matter, or a loud singer. If you have a singer that's not only loud, but maybe really harsh, maybe a real gravelly sounding voice, a real distorted singing style, the large diaphragm condenser might shine too much light on those details, those throaty, spitty details, and it could actually sound quite unpleasant. Whereas a good dynamic mic, namely this Shure SM7B that you're hearing now, is very well known for recording vocals, recording vocalists, especially aggressive singers. This microphone is known for recording almost everything from Red Hot Chili Peppers, everything they've ever done, as far as I know, Michael Jackson's Thriller, and endless podcasts. You see this microphone famously on a great percentage of all the YouTube videos out there, radio broadcasts, TV shows. This is a very, very common microphone, and I think it was designed from its inception to be a broadcast microphone. Now, fourthly, you have ribbon microphones. Ribbon microphones tend to be dark. Generally speaking, they're a dark microphone. So say if the dynamic mic didn't smooth over a harsh vocal enough, then you might want to try a ribbon mic. If you wanted a mic to have more of a vintage sound, you might opt for a ribbon microphone because in the 50s, 40s and 50s, I suppose, they used ribbon mics in a lot of recordings. So say, for example, you got a saxophone, and maybe that upper boost, that upper high mid boost on the dynamic mic is going to make the saxophone sound harsh. That's when you could reach for a ribbon mic. Ribbon mics are also very famous for capturing guitar amps. You have to be careful because the ribbon in there is very delicate and a very loud source could break the ribbon. But apart from being smoother and darker than just about any other microphone, they have a different pattern. They have a pattern called figure 8. So it means it picks up equally from the front and the back of the microphone. And because of that, they make especially good guitar amps, maybe not so much for metal, but for blues, rock and roll, rock character guitar players, guitarists that use a really nice amp. Because they pick up from both sides, they'll get some of the sound of the room and some of the sound of the amp, and of course, mostly the sound of the amp because of the proximity of the amp. But they give a little bit of that room as well, so it gives some depth to the recording and tends to make the recording sound more like the guitar amp in the room. Often these mics are paired with a dynamic mic because of the diminished high frequency response on the ribbon mic. That's made up with the high frequency boost on the dynamic mic, and blending them together to taste is how very, very many engineers get an excellent guitar tone. So since we talked about polar patterns, there's basically 3 or 4 different types of polar patterns. There's 4, but some of them vary even in between, so it's almost infinite, the polar patterns. But generally speaking, the 4 patterns are cardioid, which most microphones are. The cardioid microphones pick up from the front. They reject somewhat from the sides and reject more so from the back. Then we have figure 8, which we talked about, picking up from the front and the back, but rejecting from the sides. Then we have omnidirectional, which picks up evenly all the way 360 degrees around the mic, spherically, actually. And then finally, the 4th one is hypercardioid, which picks up a narrower pattern from the front, rejecting more from the sides. But there is a trade-off that it starts to pick up a little more from the back, so you have to be careful with hypercardioid mics. And generally speaking, for the home studio, the cardioid pattern is really the most useful because we don't have these excellent ambient spaces in our studios. So being able to pick up the qualities of the room is not really something that we can use to our advantage in a small space, especially, even in this room, it's a little bit dead. Having said that, the guitar amp still benefits from a little bit of that breathing from the backside of the ribbon mic. And furthermore, on the ribbon mic, as they pick up from both sides, many ribbon mics, not all, but many of them have a darker side and a brighter side. So that gives you more on your palette to choose from. What they used to do in the 50s, they would take advantage of this figure 8 pattern, and they would put the band on one side of the room and have the singer on the other, singing next to the mic, and then the band in the distance, they'd be recording to one track, and they would mix the band by putting the drums further away, the bass maybe closer, and the guitar, the electric guitar, whatever, maybe closer still. And they would get the mix of the band by the proximity from the player to the microphone. And then the singer would be on the other side, singing just straight in close to the mic. And that would be the mix, just by positioning the players in relation to the distance of the mic would be the single one-track mono mix. That's how it was done. Now, when we speak about topology, there's basically 3 kinds of topologies. There is a tube mic, which generally is a tube and transformer in combination. This is a Neumann U67. This is a representative of one of the finest tube mics available, ever made. There are, of course, others out there, the AKG C12, the Neumann U47, among others. And there are some modern ones out there that I'll even get to, one really outstanding contender. But anytime you put a tube in a microphone or anything like a compressor or a preamp, a tube tends to give you this harmonic distortion that does kind of two things. One, it will smooth off the transients a little bit. Two, it will bolster the low end frequency because of the distortion will manifest itself down in the low mids and the lows, giving this mic deeper low frequency tones than the signal that goes in. It's going to color the tones in a beautiful way. Secondly, there's a transformer in here which also imparts color, and it just flatters the sound. It's something that's going to be different depending on the transformers that are used. Transformers are something that are really in big debate and big hype these days. Back when I began recording back in the early 2000s, tubes were the big hype, and they were making a lot of gear that had tubes in it, but not transformers. And that would be a topology that they call tube, T-O-O-B, because it's not really a tube topology. True tube topology uses a combination of a tube and a transformer. Now this mic looks nearly exactly the same. This is a Neumann U87. This does not have a tube. This is a solid state mic, but it still has a transformer. So you're going to have the benefit of the color of the transformer, which is going to impart a flattering color to your voice or to whatever instrument, adding what they call weight to the recording. But it's going to not shave off those transients up at the top end. It's going to be more accurate up at the top end. That might be something you like or something that you don't like. It just depends on the flavor of the soup you want. But either of these microphones are going to be excellent. It's really splitting hairs. But one advantage of having a mic that is just solid state is it's going to be much more reliable over a long period of time. Anytime you have anything with tubes in the studio, you have to contend with tubes going bad. And that starts to manifest itself in the form of distortion and noise that's going to gradually introduce itself. So you never know, you could be halfway through a session and realize, oh, your tube has gone bad. So if you have a tube microphone, it's good to have extra tubes in the studio. But if you have a solid state microphone, that's something you don't have to worry about, and that's something to think about. And the third topology is transformerless. So this AKG C414 TL2, this is a more than a 20-year-old microphone. This is a transformerless version of the C414. And when you think transformerless, it's more linear. It doesn't have that quote-unquote flattering quality of a transformer. It's more accurate. It's more honest. So they made this mic to stand up alongside the new digital technology of the time. This mic has this classic design CK12 capsule like the AKG C12 I had mentioned earlier, which was a tube transformer mic, combined with a transformerless topology. So this is going to be faster, more accurate, more linear in frequency response, yet is still a large diaphragm dynamic mic with a contemporary frequency curve that does boost up on the highs and have those extended lows. When we're talking about something that is accurate, what we're looking at is a frequency response that is absolutely as flat as possible, going as low as possible and as high as possible, and maintaining a flat response. That is the characteristic of a very expensive microphone. That's also a microphone that you can EQ anywhere you want, and it's not going to exacerbate any peaks or valleys that might be present in the frequency response of the mic. And the thing about small diaphragm condenser mics, it's really similar to speakers. You can spend more and more and more and more on speakers, and you can generally expect better and better and better and better quality. When it comes to large diaphragm microphones, that might also be the case, but it doesn't mean it's going to be better for a given application. Maybe one mic sounds better on my voice than the other, just because each one is going to have its own little curve. Maybe one is going to flatter my voice better, or maybe the dynamic mic is better because of the reasons I've described earlier. But when accuracy is your objective, then spending more on a small diaphragm condenser mic is probably going to get you a better microphone, and I will illustrate that. But before I illustrate it specifically, I want to talk about my findings, because I have 3 sets of small diaphragm condensers. I have these Shure SM81s. These are the first mics I ever bought. And quite frankly, I found them just a little bit dark. I use them for overheads. I use them for acoustic guitars, often in stereo. And I always did find them a little bit dark. I've experimented with other mic preamps. Never really changed it. Always having to shelf a little bit of high EQ on there. Then I went on this search, and actually my objective was mainly acoustic guitars. And I first found the Neumann KM184 that seemed like it was going to be perfect. Excellent for acoustic guitars. But when I listened to comparisons, and also I listened to people's opinions, there were certain people out there that weren't happy with the low frequency response, that it seemed to cut off the lows a little bit more than some people liked. Turns out with acoustic guitar, that's actually not such a bad thing. But I did this listening comparison. I found somewhere online that were comparing, 30, 40 different microphones, from the AKGs to the SM81s, on and on and on and on and on, to the SE8s, and to these Schoeps CMC6s. I believe they were the CMC6s, but Schoeps has a line of different ones, the Mark 5s, the Mark 4s, the Mark 3s, the Mark 2s. These are the Mark 5s with the CMC6 amplifier. The Mark 5 has the capsule that can be both omni or cardioid with a switch. The other versions, you actually have to switch out the capsules. The capsules are very expensive in these microphones. When I listened to all the comparisons of all the microphones, the SE8s, the Schoeps sounded the best. Absolutely the best. The Neumann sounded very good on acoustic guitar, but the low frequencies were a little less. And in a mix, in the context of a mix, that's probably preferred. But just listening to solo acoustic guitar, the Schoeps microphones sounded the best. The cleanest, the clearest, the most present, the most detailed. These microphones cost well over $3,000, well over 3,000 euros for a set. Actually, about twice as much as the Neumanns. Now, the SE8s were the closest contender. And to my ear, I actually couldn't hear a difference between these and the Schoeps. And these, when I bought them, I think I paid $3.99 for the stereo pair. Now they're a little bit more. I think now they're $5.99. They might still be $3.99 if you get them at Thomann. If you get them, you have to shop around, but I had seen them at a higher price. These have a low frequency roll-off, which could make them more in the camp of the Neumanns if I needed them to drop off some of those lows. But in the flat position, to my ear, on this test, they sounded indistinguishable from mics that cost 10 times the price. So this SE8 microphone is something I would highly recommend for the budget-conscious home recording artist. And in short, I would recommend a good large diaphragm microphone. And I'm going to get into cheaper large diaphragm microphones, and I'm going to talk about them. This one is the Audio-Technica AT2020, and it's not a bad microphone, but you will see the trade-offs in the next chapter. And before I get to that, I want to just give a shout out to one. This is a real desert island microphone, because this is a genuine tube microphone with a transformer. This microphone is fantastic, and this thing only costs about $1,500. I know that's a lot of money, but when you compare it to the U67, this thing's coming in at over $7,000. So if you want a good, true tube microphone, this is a Telefunken Copperhead. It's called the CU29. This particular one has no polar pattern selection. It's just a cardioid pattern. Again, that's the most frequently used pattern anyway, especially for the home studio. But they do have a version that's slightly more expensive and does have the polar pattern options. This microphone is fan-freaking-tastic. And if you have the budget to get a mic like this and these SE8s for less than $2,000, you can have, I know that's a lot, but you can have really stunning microphones that you can do anything with. A couple $100 more, grab yourself a dynamic mic like the SM7B, and you can control the universe as we know it. Now let's get into some specifics. So I'd like to take this time before we continue to introduce you to the sponsor of this show, me. I don't have any sponsors, I don't have any affiliates, I don't even have income from my viewership on YouTube, but I would like to put more effort into this channel and give you more content and more value. I would love to build this channel up and up and up. And the way I have in mind to support this channel is by offering you courses. I have 2 courses that I want to offer. The first one is already available. It's called Devin Graves' Sing Like a Rock Star. I give you all of my decades of experience on singing, on performing, on recording, everything that you need to know how to perform like a professional. And second, I'm now about to launch my new course, Epic Home Recording. As you know, I have Epic Sound Productions here. This is Epic Sound Studios, also known as Studio D. And I offer my services to anybody that wants to come and get an amazing production. But I'm in one location and you're in another location, and maybe you don't have the money to spend on such a great experience. So I'm offering a course so that you can learn how to record yourself like an absolute pro. Record, mix, and produce like a rock star, like a pro. And I would like to add that this video is a chapter in both courses, because in the singing course you do learn how to record your voice, and this video is a free sample of my course, one of many chapters. And if you enjoy this content, maybe you'll really enjoy either course. Now back to the video. Okay, so now we've spoken in really broad generalities about microphone types. And now I want to get a little more specific, showing the differences of microphones, not only in type, but in budget range. And you can see on the frequency response graphs what is actually happening. And this might give you a really good idea of what mics to blend with other mics so that the mixes fit together before you even touch an EQ. Now I want to start with some kind of extreme examples. This set of charts here is the AKG C414 TL2. And what you'll see here is this ruler flat response down from 20 Hertz, dipping down at around the mid-range, around 2000 Hertz, boosting up significantly between 4 and 5K, and then undulating gently up and down, peaking at about 8K, finally at 15K, dropping back down again. This is a very wide boost and a lift, and this could be very good for lifting out all of the intelligibility, the sibilance, the air, the presence, all in one wide band of a vocal or another instrument. The danger happens when you start to use the same mic, even a good mic like this, across a bunch of instruments. So say I recorded my vocal with the C414, the TL2. The ULS one doesn't have this boost here, at least not quite to this degree. But this is held in very high regard for vocals for just this reason. And so it's going to make a very good present vocal sound without adding any EQ to these bands. But the danger of it is if I also recorded my acoustic guitar, and maybe I used a pair of these for my overheads, and maybe I used this for some hand percussion, and maybe this was my only mic in the studio, having this excellent mic, using it on everything is going to start to really build up on these frequencies across the entire mix. So a way to combat that is on other instruments, on overheads, say for example, to use small diaphragm condenser. Now remember, we talked about small diaphragm condensers as accurate. Now you can see what I meant by large diaphragm condensers being hi-fi, having a very low frequency extension, and having this, in this case, this lift up in the high range, making the instrument or the voice sound actually bigger than it is. But then we want some accuracy. We use a small diaphragm condenser, which is more accurate, still captures absolute detail, but ruler flat. These are the SE8s. This is the SE8 microphone, and you can see there's a slight dip at 20 hertz, and then from 30 hertz all the way up to 5K. It's ruler flat, completely smooth. This is a hallmark of a very expensive mic, even though this microphone is not that expensive. Then a slight lift peaking at about 8K, 6 to 8K, and then back down again at 10, 15K, back down to 0, slight drop off at 20K. So if I use this for my acoustic guitars and my overheads, I'm not going to get this buildup across all these frequencies. Even more so, let's look at this ribbon mic. This is the Coles 4038. And you can see it's not exactly ruler flat, and the frequency response goes, well, it seems to drop off before it gets to 20. But these mics are known for having a very good low end. Lifts up a little bit at 80, 50 hertz, and then back down to 0 at above 200, a lift again, and that 200 hertz is really responsible for that fullness in a voice. In any instrument, that fullness is around the 200 to 300 hertz range. That's also the muddiness as well. So often people cut a lot in this range, but if you cut too much in a voice, for example, the voice is going to sound thin. So maybe if you have a thin sounding voice, this Coles is going to sound really good. Of course, down here at 10K, at all that sparkle, where your cymbals would be, where your S's and T's and your breath would be, it's going to actually be very, very dark there, which might be good for blending on a guitar cab when you are blending it with a dynamic mic. I'll get to that in a moment. But these microphones, especially really expensive ribbon microphones, take EQ really, really well. It has been said that if you want to improve the quality of your equalizer, buy a ribbon mic. So it was known that Alan Parsons would use these 4038s for overheads, and without even listening, he would boost 10K on the console by 10 dB, just crank this up. And then you get this curve for the cymbals, and it's, well, his work. So it sounds really, really sweet, but it does need EQ. The point is that it wouldn't be fighting this if I stacked it on top of each other, and then I could choose with EQ how much to increase or not, and where to increase. Now, let's look at a dynamic mic. This is the curve of the SM7B, and this solid black line represents no high pass filter and no high lift filter, I guess you can call it, because there's two switches. On the microphone you're hearing no high pass filter, so you're hearing this line, but the high lift is engaged and you're hearing this line, this dotted line. And you'll notice that that is happening starting at 1K and ending at about 4K, and at 4K it drops down. That is a really good place to dip down because 4K is the most irritating frequency, really a harsh, irritating frequency, so it might not be any coincidence that it dips there and then comes back up again at 5, 6K. And this boost here is going to sit about here. So if I used this for my cymbals, people often boost cymbals at about 12 to 14K, and that would give a similar boost to this. And then I recorded my vocals with this mic, and then my high frequencies in the vocal mic would occupy this space, and then would also drop down around here. And if my overheads left it this way, left it even, or I'll probably drop them off anyway because the kick and the bass are going to fill in these frequencies, so very likely I'll use a cut there anyway. But you can see how layering this microphone with this microphone is going to have the high frequencies occupying different areas, and it's going to sit well in the mix without having to juggle a bunch of EQ. We'll go back to small diaphragm condenser mics, and we'll compare a few of them. Now this one down here is the Neumann KM184, and there are no switches, no high pass filters on this mic, but it is naturally set up with a high pass filter in place. On the SE8, it's flat here on the low end until I engage one of two switch positions, which will gradually start cutting the lows either at 200 or 100 respectively, depending on which switch position. The Neumann naturally comes in similarly to if the switch was cut here at the 100 position, which is a pretty common position to cut your lows. And as you see, this curve also super smooth, ruler flat with a slight lift that peaks at around 878K. Very, very similar to the SE microphone. And it comes in at about 3 times the price of the SE. So to me, the SE is a winner all the way around because you have this very similar but even more slight boost, which might be more manageable in conjunction with a mic such as this. So these two microphones coming in at a very different price point. These Neumanns are close to $1,000 each, and this SE8 is between $399 to $599 for a pair, and that's a match stereo set. So these mics, these SE mics, these SE8s are clear winners. Not only do they have that 3-position high-pass filter, but they also have a 10 and a 20 dB pad. So these are great. I use these for snare bottoms. I use them for hi-hats, and they're just fantastic, smooth-sounding microphones at a very good price. The only thing better is my beloved Schoeps CMC6s. I have a pair of these that I'm very proud of. Now, keep in mind these cost about 10 times the price of the SE8s. And when we look at this graph, there are no low-cut filters. There is only a switch changing this mic from cardioid to omnidirectional, which is a very nice thing. The other versions of this mic, you can replace and interchange cardioid and omnidirectional capsules at about $1,000 plus per capsule. So just having them built in like this is a real treat. Having said that, I keep them in the cardioid position most of the time. But if you look at this ruler flat from 20, it doesn't drop down like the SE does. It's completely ruler flat from 20 all the way up to 2 kilohertz, then a gentle lift from 2 peaking at 5K, and then it holds that lift and it gradually drops off by about a half a dB down to 20K, and at 20K it is still up about 2 dB, where these mics are down about 2 dB at 20K. So what that really means is, like, this microphone is designed for capturing ensembles, for capturing symphony, for capturing chambers, where you have an array of instruments representing a wide tonal response. And in the high frequency energy, from the high mids to the very high frequencies, you capture all of that subtle detail of the woodwinds, of the strings, of the brass. And then as you get down to the mid-range, it's going to drop down because the mid-range is going to actually be more pronounced and more forward. So you've got your trombones and your violas, and then you come down to your cellos and your pianos and your double bass and your timpanis, and everything is going to be even across the board. These are very, very excellent microphones for field recording, for stereo symphony recording. That's what they're actually used for. They're also very excellent for overheads and for acoustic guitars, in which case you might want to engage a high-pass filter at the console, at the mic preamp, or in the mix. Or not, depending. If you just have an acoustic guitar where there's nothing else competing for that low end, you can just leave it open and just get a beautiful acoustic guitar sound. One more point I'd like to make about small diaphragm condensers, and what you can see is this consistency in the idea of accuracy and a little attention to detail up at the top end. That's something that they all have in common. Now, if I were to get a more budget microphone, this is the Lewitt LCT040, and this microphone comes in at about $140, $150 for a pair. This is a real steal. These microphones are very good, held in very high regard, used the world over by all kinds of engineers. I just want you to see regarding accuracy, this is what you get, what you pay for, when I said that the more you spend, the more you can expect on a small diaphragm condenser. If you get one that's cheaper, you get on this particular version, you have a low cut that starts to gradually come in at 100 hertz and peaks at about 6 dB down there at 20 hertz. Then it kind of undulates. It's not perfectly even. It goes kind of up the zero line between 100 hertz and 2K. A little bit wavy and a little bit less than level. And then at about 2K, then it starts to go up. And then at 5K, it starts to peak, then back down again, and then peak again at 10K to 15K, and then down again at 20K. So this microphone actually might be really excellent for overheads when we want to normally boost these frequencies anyway, similar to the AKG C414, but using these two microphones in conjunction with one another might cause some problems in this common area. So since we're talking about now back to the large diaphragm condensers, I want to show you now this one on top. This is the Neumann U67, my beloved U67, and you can see here is the U87. And okay, here we have omnidirectional, cardioid, and figure eight bi-directional, as they call it. And here you have them stacked one atop the other. But you can see if I looked at the omni, how we have this peak here that's at 10K and then drops down at 15K. You have the same thing going on with the U87, and then a little lesser so in cardioid mode, the yellow line, and lesser still in the figure eight pattern. There's a little dip also in the figure eight pattern of the U87 that you also see here in the U67. So generally these mics are super similar. I mean, on paper they look identical, but they're not, because you have the tube in the U67, which causes some rich harmonic distortion that gives you some added presence up on the top end, some added sparkle to the breath, some added detail, and you have some added girth to the lows and the low mids. It's harmonic distortion. It's not frequency response. This is color that fills these things in such a beautiful and natural way that people are willing to spend more than $7,000 on a mic. Now, the U87 costs less than half the price of the U67, and in some ways might be a smarter bet if, for example, you're recording instrument upon instrument upon instrument. The U67 might work against you with all that color on the low end and all that sparkle on the high end, because as that adds up, similarly to the way it will add up with that peak in highs on the other microphones I mentioned, that the low-end harmonic distortion, low-mid harmonic distortion might also add up, and you might end up with a muddy-sounding recording in the end that you have to start filtering some of that stuff out. So the U87 will be free of those anomalies, those artifacts that are, however pleasing they are, they won't start adding up on you. So it might be good to have U87s if you could afford to do it this way. Having these for your overheads, having these for your acoustic instruments if you wanted. Still, again, you can use different polar patterns to raise or lower that high frequency lift. And also using the omnidirectional pattern counteracts all of the proximity effect. So you can get in really close to the mic for that intimate sound in an omnidirectional pattern, and you won't have that buildup of bass frequencies. And if you have a well-treated room, the omnidirectional pattern won't pick up your walls in a bad way. Another way to combat that proximity effect, by the way, is with that high shelf filter, the high pass filter that will give you this cut here. Now, if we were to look at an inexpensive large diaphragm condenser mic, we looked at the small diaphragm condenser mic, and what you're going to see is a similar characteristic, which is You have, okay, we have even a similar low cut that's going to bottom out at about 80 hertz. Then it's going to come up at 200, and this line between 200 and 2K, 3K isn't level. It's angled upwards towards the 3K, then drops down at 4K, not such a bad thing. Then at 5K, 6K, it starts to ripple up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And this is where it becomes a problem when you start to add additive EQ up in this region. Say 8K, it's very common to add 8K to vocals for the presence, 10K for the air. And when you start adding EQ to these cheap mics, which sound really good on their own, once you start adding EQ, it exacerbates these peaks and valleys here, and you start to get a harsh sound because you have peaks and dips at frequencies that are just very near each other. And that is an attribute that expensive mics just don't have. So I hope that this gives you something to think about when it comes to what you spend on a microphone. I would encourage you to go to tomon.de, and you can go to their microphone section and you can listen to all the forms of microphones with male vocals, female vocals, acoustic guitars, and maybe drums and other things, and get an educated input on what these mics sound like, which ones are dark, which ones sound good, especially as you get more experience with your recordings and you know more about what you want out of your microphones. You can start to listen to these other microphones and find the microphones that fill those gaps. Educate yourself. Learn how to read these charts. Learn how to fit these charts together like a puzzle to fill in the spaces that other microphones leave for holes, so to speak. And although these rules of thumb of accuracy, hi-fi, high sound pressure levels, smoothing of the harsh frequencies, a good vocal curve, or just being dark to further reduce harshness of a saxophone or a horn section. These are kind of principles to think about. They're not steadfast rules. This will give you an educated guess of what mic you can reach for first. And if it doesn't work, then you know it doesn't work. I urge you to try it, to record, to listen back, to first mess with mic placement if it's not really working for you. That's a subject for another conversation. But if it doesn't work, then try something else. And maybe the broken rule is the way to go, but you'll only know if you try. And so if you have a small arsenal of mics, a large diaphragm, whether it's expensive or cheap, a dynamic, and a couple small diaphragm condenser mics is going to give you an excellent arsenal for your sonic palette. So I hope you learned something from this, and I hope you put it to good use. And now here's to you making some killer music.